Let's begin at the moment when the relationship between the United States and India seemed to be entering a golden era. The year was 2019. In a stadium in Houston, Texas, over 50,000 people gathered for an event that would be branded around the world as Howdy Modi. On the surface, it was a celebration, a cultural showcase, a political rally, and a public demonstration of mutual respect between two of the world's largest democracies. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and then President Donald Trump walked hand in hand before a roaring crowd, smiling for the cameras, trading warm words, and projecting the image of an unshakable friendship. The optics were flawless. It wasn't just an event, it was a performance of unity, broadcast live to millions. But if we look closer, what was happening on that stage wasn't just about friendship. It was about narrative construction. Political leaders understand that images can sometimes carry more weight than treaties. The handshake, the smiles, the carefully scripted lines, these weren't spontaneous gestures. They were deliberate signals to both domestic audiences and the global stage. We are partners, we share values, and together we stand stronger. In that moment, both countries wanted the world to see them as aligned, a counterbalance to the rising influence of China, a pairing of economic powerhouses, a convergence of democratic ideals. Yet, beneath this public theater there were already cracks. The very same leaders celebrating shared values had been sparring behind closed doors over market access, trade imbalances, and tariff disputes. In fact, even as they stood on that platform proclaiming unity, each side was quietly preparing to defend its own economic turf. The applause was genuine, but so was the mistrust. This is the paradox of diplomacy: the louder the celebration, sometimes the more fragile the foundation. Psychologically, Howdy Modi was a masterclass in what we might call the politics of symbolism. Humans respond to imagery, to emotional resonance, far more than to spreadsheets or policy briefings. That's why leaders stage these events, because they know the mind remembers what the heart feels. And for that day, the feeling was optimism. But the danger is that symbolism, while powerful, can be mistaken for substance. If you build an alliance on photographs and speeches, but not on aligned interests and mutually beneficial agreements, you're building on sand. It's tempting to think of Howdy Modi as a high point, but perhaps it was more like a mirage, beautiful, inspiring, but fleeting. The cheers in Houston could not drown out the economic disagreements simmering beneath. And that's the lesson in international relations. As in life, the measure of a relationship is not in how brightly it shines during celebration, but in how solid it stands when the cameras are gone. If we mistake theater for truth, we risk believing in a friendship that exists only in the photograph. If Howdy Modi was the bright photograph framed for the world to admire, then what lay beneath it was a far more complicated canvas. The truth is, the U.S. India partnership in that moment was not a fortress built on unshakable trust, but a structure balanced on a fragile set of convergences. Yes, there were shared goals. Both nations saw value in countering China's growing assertiveness. Both wanted to expand defense cooperation. Both envisioned a future where technological innovation could be a mutual engine of growth. These common interests created the appearance of solidity. But beneath that appearance were the kinds of unresolved frictions that tend to erode even the strongest alliances if left unattended. Trade was at the heart of it. For years, India had been seeking greater access to American technology, investment, and agricultural markets, while the United States had been pressing for a reduction in tariffs, better intellectual property protections, and a more open playing field for its companies in India. Each side believed the other was holding back, guarding its own advantage too closely. The American narrative was that India was reaping the benefits of the global market while keeping too many barriers in place. The Indian narrative was that the U.S. was using the language of free trade as a tool to tilt the scales in its own favor. Neither story was entirely wrong, and neither was entirely right, but perception, in politics, can matter more than fact. The philosophical tension went deeper than trade policy. At its core, it was a difference in worldview. The United States has long championed the idea, at least outwardly, that open markets and minimal barriers create prosperity for all. India, on the other hand, carries the memory of colonial exploitation and the instinct to shield domestic industries from foreign dominance. What looks to one side like protectionism looks to the other like self-preservation. And when those instincts collide, agreements become harder to reach, even when the broader strategic alignment remains intact. Psychologically, this kind of relationship is like a friendship where both people enjoy each other's company, but quietly resent each other's habits. The laughs are real, the shared experiences are valuable, but underneath there is an unspoken awareness that, given the right circumstances, the partnership could turn competitive, even adversarial. The friendship, is conditional, not absolute. And in the case of U.S. India relations, the conditions were beginning to shift in ways neither side could fully control. This is why the post-Howdy Modi glow was always vulnerable. It rested on the hope that shared strategic concerns would override economic disputes. But history shows us that unresolved tensions don't dissolve with optimism, they accumulate. And when enough of them gather, even the most promising alliances begin to creak under their own weight. The real strength of a partnership isn't in how well it handles agreement, but in how it navigates disagreement. Without that resilience, even the most celebrated friendships can falter when the applause fades. The unraveling didn't happen with a single dramatic announcement, but with a series of moves and countermoves that gradually replaced smiles with suspicion. It began when the United States, under the Trump administration, decided to revoke India's preferential trade status under the generalized system of preferences. Overnight, billions of dollars worth of Indian exports lost their duty-free access to the U.S. market. From Washington's perspective, this was a matter of fairness, an attempt to push India toward what it considered more balanced and reciprocal trade. From New Delhi's perspective, it was a blunt and unexpected blow, one that ignored the broader strategic goodwill both sides had been cultivating. India responded in kind, raising tariffs on a range of American products, from almonds to apples, sending an equally clear message: if economic coercion was to be the new language of this partnership, India could speak it fluently too. What followed was not just a technical trade dispute, but the political equivalent of an argument that had been waiting to happen. The grievances each side had quietly carried for years now found expression in public policy. Tariff after tariff, retaliatory measure after retaliatory measure, the conversation shifted from cooperation to confrontation. The deeper issue wasn't simply the economic cost, though farmers, manufacturers, and exporters on both sides certainly felt it. The real damage was psychological. Tariffs are more than numbers, they are signals. They tell the other side, we don't trust you to play fair, so we're going to protect ourselves. And once that message is sent, it's difficult to unhear. The goodwill built through years of summits, joint statements, and defense agreements can be eroded quickly when each side starts to believe the other is acting in bad faith. This is where the human element of diplomacy becomes unavoidable. Nations, like individuals, respond emotionally when they feel wronged. Pride becomes a factor. The logic of win-win economics is replaced by the instinct of don't get taken advantage of, and that instinct, once triggered, is hard to reverse. For the U.S. and India, the tariff exchanges became a symbolic contest, not just about almonds or steel, but about sovereignty, equality, and the refusal to be the first to back down. In hindsight, this was the inflection point when the Howdy Modi optimism gave way to something far more guarded. The language of partnership remained, but it was now punctuated with conditions, caveats, and veiled threats. The world could still see the photo of two leaders walking hand in hand, but behind the scenes, the handshake had tightened into a grip, firm, cautious, and unwilling to let the other side take the lead. And that is the danger of letting unresolved tensions spill into open confrontation once trust is replaced by tit for tat. The relationship is no longer about building something together, but about making sure the other side doesn't get ahead. In that mindset, even the strongest alliances can quietly turn into rivalries. Beneath the tariffs and retaliatory measures lay a deeper rift, not just a clash of policies, but a clash of philosophies. On one side, the United States came to the table with a worldview shaped by decades of advocating free markets, open competition, and minimal trade barriers. It framed its demands in the language of fairness and reciprocity, insisting that true partnership meant letting markets determine the flow of goods and services without heavy government interference. On the other side, India approached the same table with a very different historical memory. Having endured centuries of colonial exploitation, it had cultivated an instinct to protect its domestic industries, to guard against economic overexposure, and to view openness, not as an unquestionable virtue, but as a potential vulnerability. To an American negotiator, India's reluctance to dismantle certain protections looked like stubborn protectionism. To an Indian policymaker, the U.S., insistence on market liberalization looked like an attempt to tilt the field in its own favor. Each side believed it was being reasonable, each side saw the other as unwilling to compromise. The problem with such ideological divides is that they are not easily solved with a single deal. You can negotiate over percentages and quotas, but you cannot sign away deeply held beliefs about what keeps a nation strong and secure. Philosophically, this is the kind of conflict that arises when two people want to build something together but disagree on the blueprint. The American blueprint says tear down the walls, let the sunlight in, and trust the open air. The Indian blueprint says keep the wall strong, control the gates, and let people in on your own terms. Both designs have their logic, both have their flaws, and neither is likely to be fully abandoned. That's why trade negotiations between these two nations often felt less like problem-solving and more like two architects arguing over the foundation while the house remained unfinished. What made matters more delicate was that these economic philosophies were intertwined with political realities at home. In the U.S., leaders needed to show they were securing better deals for American workers and farmers. In India, leaders had to prove they were not allowing foreign powers to dictate economic policy. This meant that even small concessions could be painted as political weakness, making compromise risky. The tariff battles were not just economic skirmishes. They were performances for domestic audiences, each side needing to appear firm and unyielding. And so, what could have been a negotiation aimed at mutual benefit became a test of endurance. Neither side wanted to blink first. In such a standoff, the relationship stops moving forward not because there is no desire for progress, but because the deeper philosophical divide keeps pulling the partners back into the same old argument. In the end, this is the lesson: you cannot build a lasting alliance if your guiding principles are in constant opposition. Without reconciling the underlying philosophies, every handshake will carry the weight of an unspoken disagreement, and eventually the silence between those handshakes will speak louder than the smiles. What kept the relationship from collapsing entirely was the undeniable reality that the United States and India still needed each other. For all the bitterness over tariffs and the philosophical chasm on trade, there remained a powerful strategic glue: the shared recognition that China's growing assertiveness posed challenges neither country could handle alone. The Indo-Pacific was becoming the new arena of global competition, and both Washington and New Delhi understood that cooperation in defense, intelligence sharing, and regional stability was not optional, but essential. This is the paradox of their bond. They were strategic partners out of necessity, but friends only when it was convenient. On the security front, there was a common language: joint military exercises, intelligence exchanges, coordinated naval patrols. These were not symbolic gestures, they were tangible acts of alignment. Yet, the trust built in defense cooperation often struggled to spill over into the economic arena. It was as if the two sides could march together when facing a common adversary, but when seated across the negotiating table, they became wary competitors again. Part of this tension lies in the psychology of alliances. When two nations are drawn together by a shared threat, the partnership is reactive, not proactive. It is held together by what they oppose, rather than by a shared vision of what they want to build. And that makes the bond inherently unstable. Remove or reduce the threat, and the partnership risks drifting apart. This is why, despite the clear overlap in defense interests, both countries continued to hedge, the United States questioning whether India would stand firm in a crisis, and India wondering whether America's commitments would survive a change in administration or political mood. It is also why suspicion lingered just beneath the diplomatic language. The U.S. saw India as an indispensable partner, but not necessarily a predictable one. India valued the strategic alignment, but was cautious of becoming too dependent on Washington's goodwill. Both were wary of giving the other too much leverage. This is not unique to U.S.-India relations. It is the nature of partnerships built on pragmatism rather than deep trust. The result was a kind of dual reality in the security sphere. Handshakes were firm and purposeful. In the economic sphere, the same hands often clenched into guarded fists. Each side was waiting for the other to make the first move toward genuine trust, and in the meantime, cooperation was conducted with one eye always on the exit. And that is the quiet truth behind many strategic partnerships. In the modern world, they can endure for years without ever becoming truly secure. They last not because they have resolved their differences, but because walking away would be more dangerous than staying together. The challenge and the opportunity is to turn that fragile necessity into something that feels like choice. Because until it does, even the most powerful alliances will always stand on uncertain ground. When the dust settled, what remained was not just a story about tariffs or trade disputes, but a cautionary tale about the limits of symbolic diplomacy. The Howdy Modi moment had been a powerful display of connection, but it proved that warmth on stage cannot substitute for the hard work of aligning long-term interests. Nations, like individuals, can be swept up in the energy of shared enthusiasm, but unless that enthusiasm is anchored in mutual benefit, it will fade when tested by reality. In this case, the test came swiftly. Economic grievances that had been politely ignored took center stage, strategic alignment proved unable to bridge philosophical divides, and domestic politics on both sides turned every concession into a liability. What emerged was a reminder that alliances are not maintained by photographs or speeches, they are maintained by constant negotiation, by the willingness to resolve discomfort, instead of simply covering it with ceremony. The U.S. India relationship during this period teaches a deeper truth about international affairs. Trust is not built in public moments, but in private agreements. The world sees the handshake, but it's the conversations behind closed doors that determine whether that handshake means something. Without those difficult, sometimes uncomfortable, conversations about trade imbalances, about market access, about long-term strategic commitments, the foundation will remain fragile no matter how impressive the public optics. Philosophically, this is the difference between appearance and essence. Appearance is the dazzling stadium event, the glowing headlines, the social media clips. Essence is the quiet, painstaking alignment of policies, values, and expectations. Appearance can be built in a day, essence takes years. And in the gap between those two, disappointment often grows. The lesson here is not that symbolism is worthless. In politics, symbolism can inspire, rally, and shape global perception. But it is only a starting point. Without substance, symbolism is like a beautifully wrapped gift with nothing inside, impressive for a moment, but ultimately hollow. The challenge for both Washington and New Delhi is to ensure that their next public celebration is backed by private agreements strong enough to survive the inevitable strains of partnership. If anything, this episode should motivate leaders and citizens to demand more than pageantry from their international relationships. It should push them to look past the stage smiles and ask the harder questions. What are we building together? What problems have we actually solved? And what will remain when the cameras are gone? Because in the end, the survival of any alliance rests on one simple truth: relationships last not because they look good in public, but because they are strong in private. And if that strength is missing, no amount of applause will keep the walls from eventually collapsing.